A courthouse built on promises. A mayor who believed justice wore no color, until one night when a black man in plain clothes walked his own halls and was treated like a trespasser by the very system he swore to serve. Handcuffs, mockery, silence. But here's the twist. They didn't just arrest a man. They tried to erase a leader and woke a city instead. Stay with us because this story isn't about what broke that night. It's about what rose in its place. The halls of the Ashbury Municipal Building were quiet, eerily so. The evening had drained the buzz of city staff, and only a faint fluorescent flicker above the south corridor remained to light the way. It was nearly 9 p.m. when Mayor Langston Reed stepped through the side entrance with a slow, deliberate pace. He wasn't there for a meeting or a headline, just a forgotten folder, a slim leather-bound portfolio left behind after a lengthy community policy session in room 312. He'd meant to retrieve it earlier, but the day had gotten away from him. Langston moved with purpose but not urgency. Dressed down in a dark overcoat, pressed slacks, and a navy blue sweater, he didn't wear the badge or the formal air that usually accompanied him into public spaces. No staff, no aides, no official escort. Just a man retrieving his work from the halls of the city he helped lead. The silence comforted him. For a moment. Then came the footsteps. Firm, deliberate echoing against the marble floor. Langston barely had time to turn when a flashlight beam sliced across his chest. "Hey!" barked a voice, sharp and suspicious. "What are you doing here?" Langston lifted a hand gently, the other still holding his car keys. "Evening. I'm just here to pick up a file I left earlier in the council chamber." The flashlight didn't move, nor did the suspicion in the voice. "You got ID on you?" The question came from Officer Blake Riker, a white man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, crew-cut, and standing too square in his stance for the situation. His hand hovered over his belt, not on his weapon, not yet, but near enough to make a statement. Langston offered a calm nod. "I'm Mayor Reed Langston Reed. I left my ID in my jacket upstairs, was in a rush earlier, but I assure you, Riker cut him off, and I'm the Chief Justice. Don't move." Langston blinked, not in fear, but in disbelief. "Officer, if you'll just escort me to room 312, I can show you." I said, "Don't move." Riker's voice hardened. "You've got no ID. You're in a restricted hallway, and I don't recognize you." Langston took a shallow breath. "This is the municipal building I work here. I've held meetings here every Thursday night for the past 2 years." "Don't care," Riker snapped. "You're not supposed to be here after hours without clearance. And you're dressed like someone trying not to be noticed." Langston took a step back, hands slightly raised in deference. "Sir, I'm not a threat. I'm the mayor of this city. You can call dispatch and confirm it. I don't need to call anyone yet. You've got no badge, no ID, and no reason to be here that I can verify. That's a problem." Riker's voice dropped low and cold. "Turn around and face the wall." Langston stiffened. "Excuse me, you heard me. Until I confirm who you are, you're a suspect, and I don't take chances." The air in the hallway turned brittle. Somewhere down the corridor, a heater kicked on with a dull, mechanical thrum. The building suddenly felt colder. Langston's jaw tensed. "I think you know what this is," he said quietly. "This isn't about protocol. This is about who you think I am." "You want to play the race card?" Riker sneered. "How convenient." Langston didn't reply. He simply raised his hands further and said, "Call it what you want, but one of us came here to do his job. The other came looking for a problem." Riker reached for his radio. "Dispatch. I've got a non-compliant individual in the West Wing requesting backup." As the static crackled, Langston stood perfectly still, back straight, eyes locked on the hallway wall ahead. No sudden movements, no aggression. Just the quiet realization that in the very halls where he'd fought to bring justice and dignity to his city, he was now being treated like a trespasser because of the color of his skin, and in that moment he understood. This wasn't confusion, it was recognition, but not of who he was, only of what he looked like. The radio crackled back with a lazy confirmation. "Unit 7 backup en route." Langston Reed kept his hands raised, palms open, his breath steady but heavy. Years of navigating tense spaces had taught him how to control his face, his voice, his body, but nothing could completely shield him from the surge of helpless anger boiling beneath his skin. Officer Riker circled closer, now suspicion deepening with every step. "Turn around, hands on the wall." Now Langston tried again, measured but firm. "Officer, if you just check my name with Dispatch Mayor Langston Reed, you'll see I'm allowed to be here." Riker gave a short, humorless laugh. "Funny. That's the second time tonight you've mentioned being someone important. You know, impersonating a government official's a felony. Before Langston could answer, another set of footsteps echoed down the hall, faster, heavier. Officer Tom Calder arrived, younger than Riker, but built like a linebacker and with a swagger that matched his bulk. His eyes darted to Langston, narrowed and hardened within seconds. "What's the situation?" Calder asked, voice brisk. "Caught this one sneaking around city offices. Claims he's the mayor," Riker said with a smirk. "No ID, no credentials," Calder sneered. "Looks more like a burglar to me." Langston turned slightly toward Calder, careful to keep his movements slow. "I am Mayor Reed. Check with dispatch. Check the council records. Look at the security logs." But Calder wasn't listening. He's stalling. They always stall. Before Langston could react, Calder grabbed his arm roughly and spun him around. The hard shove against the cold stone wall knocked the breath from his lungs. "Hey," Langston protested, pain flashing through his shoulders as Calder yanked his arms back and clapped heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. "You're under suspicion for attempted intrusion and impersonation of a government official," Calder barked, pressing his weight into Langston's back. "You have the right to remain silent." "Not that it'll help." Langston winced against the wall, the cuffs biting into his skin. "I demand to speak to my assistant. His number's in my phone. He can confirm who I am." "Oh, you'll get your one phone call after booking," Riker said, chuckling under his breath. Langston twisted his neck slightly to meet Riker's gaze. His voice, even through the strain, held its dignity. "You're making a mistake that's bigger than you understand. Save it for your public defender," Calder jeered. Just then, Riker spotted something lying a few feet away. The leather folder Langston had come back to retrieve. It must have slipped from his grip during the scuffle. Riker stooped down and picked it up, thumbing through the contents. Inside were city council notes, official memos bearing the Ashbury City seal, and an itinerary marked Mayor's Community Session Approved Agenda. Riker held up the folder like a trophy. "What's this fancy paperwork you stole from somewhere?" Langston's stomach twisted. "That's my folder. My session. My notes." Riker flipped through a few more pages theatrically before snapping the folder shut with a smirk. "City seals and all real official looking. Too bad possession doesn't mean ownership." Langston stared at him, feeling something inside himself tighten. Not fear, but a bone-deep disgust. Not just at the humiliation, but at how easily authority had turned against him the moment suspicion was given permission to bloom. He was no longer a respected mayor in their eyes. He was an inconvenience, a threat, a stereotype behind him. Calder cinched the cuffs tighter, forcing Langston to stumble as they began hauling him down the empty hallway past framed photos of city officials, including, ironically, a portrait of Langston himself hung in a place of honor outside the council chamber. Neither officer looked up. Neither of them saw it, and even if they had, Langston doubted it would have changed a thing. Not tonight, not in Ashbury, not yet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as they dragged Langston Reed farther down the corridor, the cold metal of the cuffs slicing into his skin with every step. His shoulder ached from the rough handling. His lips were split where he'd been shoved against the wall, and he tasted blood at the corner of his mouth. Still, Langston walked tall. Still, he refused to beg. As they neared the holding area near the courthouse security office, Langston lifted his voice, calm, low, unwavering. "You might want to check that folder again," he said, voice cutting clean through the tension. Riker gave a snort without looking at him. "Nice try." But Calder hesitated. His hand still gripping Langston's arm loosened slightly. Langston caught it, the flicker of uncertainty. He pressed again, his voice a blade hidden in silk. "Go ahead. Read the first page carefully." Calder slowed his steps. He glanced at Riker, who was already dismissing it with a scoff, but something gnawed at Calder's instincts. Maybe it was the confident way Langston said it. Maybe it was the faint sheen of official seals he'd glimpsed when rifling through the folder. With a grunt, Calder stopped pulling the folder from under his arm. He flipped it open, thumbing past the printed council notes until he reached it. An official municipal ID sheet. Bold letters across the top, City of Ashbury. Office of the Mayor. Underneath a professional headshot of Langston Reed, smiling faintly and in formal text. Langston, J. Reed, Mayor, City of Ashbury. The official seal of the city stamped the bottom in raised gold ink. Calder's face paled instantly. He blinked, shook his head once like trying to clear water from his ears, but the truth stayed stubbornly printed on the page. "Riker," Calder rasped, voice cracking. "What now?" Riker snapped, impatient. Calder thrust the open folder toward him without a word. Riker snatched it, glanced down, and stiffened. A long, ugly silence filled the hallway. Langston watched them both carefully. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just stood there, blood trickling down his lip, wrists burning inside the cuffs, dignity wrapped around him like a second skin. Riker, face flushing deep red, barked out, "Well, even if he's the mayor, he didn't identify himself." He resisted questioning. "That's obstruction. Obstruction," Langston said, his voice sharp now, his patience exhausted. "I told you who I was. You didn't listen. You didn't care." Riker's mouth worked, trying to form a comeback, but Calder wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at Langston's jacket, the slight bulge of the mayoral ID badge Langston had forgotten to clip on properly before rushing back to the courthouse. Langston caught Calder's gaze and said coolly, "If you're still not sure, check my inside pocket." Calder hesitated, then cautiously reached forward. From the inside breast pocket of Langston's jacket, he pulled out the slim leather badge wallet embossed official unmistakable. He opened it. There it was, Langston's City ID photo title name, all matching the document in the folder. The bottom dropped out of Calder's stomach. His hand trembled. "Christ," Calder whispered. In that moment, footsteps echoed from the other end of the hallway. A young woman hurried in, clutching a stack of files to her chest. She wore the navy uniform of the courthouse clerks, her ID badge swinging from her neck. She looked up and froze. Her eyes widened, first in confusion, then in horror, as she took in the scene before her. The bruised black man in cuffs, the familiar face she had seen on campaign posters, televised debates, community cleanup drives. "Mayor Reed," she gasped, nearly dropping her files. Both officers stiffened. The young clerk, pale with shock, hurried forward. What's going on? Why is the mayor in handcuffs?" Riker muttered something under his breath. Calder's mouth opened and closed without sound. Langston looked directly at the officers, now voice low but cutting. "That's the same question I'll be asking." In court. The hallway seemed to contract around them. No more excuses, no more bluffing. The reality of what they had done was settling like a heavy weight across their shoulders, and the weight was only beginning. The cuffs snapped open with an awkward clatter, leaving red, angry grooves around Langston's wrists. Calder was the one who did it, his hands fumbling, his face frozen somewhere between fear and humiliation. Riker stood stiffly nearby, arms crossed now, jaw tight, refusing to meet Langston's eyes. Langston said nothing. He pulled his wrists free, slowly, flexing his fingers to get the blood flowing again. Tiny dots of blood stained the cuff of his jacket, and the cut at the corner of his mouth was still raw. But when Calder mumbled, "Sir, should we call a medic?" Langston lifted a hand sharply to cut him off. "No," he said quietly. "Don't touch me." The young courthouse clerk hovered nearby, wringing her hands nervously, her eyes darting between Langston and the officers, like she was witnessing the aftermath of a slow-moving wreck. Word was already spreading. From the courtroom doors down the main hallway, staff began to trickle into the lobby. First one or two, then clusters of 3 or 4 administrative aides, court clerks, even a couple of junior prosecutors. Conversations dropped into urgent whispers. Eyes widened, heads shook. The mayor assaulted, inside his own municipal courthouse. Langston stood rooted to the spot. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. The silence around him, the sheer magnitude of it, spoke louder than outrage ever could. Calder stammered something else under his breath, trying to frame an apology, but Langston didn't acknowledge him. Riker, stubborn to the bitter end, shifted his weight from foot to foot, the defensive set of his jaw daring anyone to call him out further. The atmosphere was suffocating. Then the double doors at the far end of the lobby burst open. Savannah Reed stormed in her heels, clicking sharply against the marble floors. She wore a charcoal gray suit, her long hair pulled back in a braid, a leather bag slung over her shoulder. Her badge from the Ashbury Civil Rights Alliance clipped to her lapel. She wasn't alone. A deputy from the mayor's office trailed behind her, eyes wide with horror, still fumbling with a phone. Savannah's eyes found her father instantly, the blood on his lip, the marks on his wrists. The 2 officers standing awkwardly nearby, her face turned to stone. Without missing a step, Savannah pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and aimed the camera directly at Riker. "State your name and badge number for the record," she said, voice calm, icy. Riker shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "For the record," Savannah repeated, cutting him off. "Officer Blake Riker," he muttered, his voice low and tight. "Badge number 2173, The lobby was dead silent. Every onlooker knew better than to intervene now. Savannah kept the camera steady, her expression razor-sharp. "And tell me, Officer Riker," she continued smoothly, "what about this man standing here tonight made you assume he didn't belong?" Riker blinked. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. "You thought he was suspicious," Savannah said, filling the silence herself. "You thought a black man in casual clothes couldn't possibly belong here inside the very building where he governs, where he works every day. Am I wrong?" Riker said nothing. Savannah slowly turned the camera to Calder. "And you?" she asked. "Anything you want to add for the record?" Calder looked like he might be sick. Langston, meanwhile, stayed still, watching, but not interfering. This was Savannah's arena now. She was wielding her outrage not as a weapon, but as precision instrument. Every word she spoke, every second of footage was cutting deeper into the truth. Finally, Savannah lowered the phone slightly. "We're not done," she said, voice lower now, almost a whisper. "You're going to explain this to the council, to the city, to the world." Behind her, more courthouse staff had gathered, faces, pale mouths tight. The reckoning had begun, and there was no stopping it now. Langston shifted his gaze toward the courthouse doors, toward the night beyond them. He wasn't just a man reclaiming his dignity anymore. He was about to tear down every assumption that had dared to put him in cuffs, and he wasn't going to do it alone. The morning sun had barely broken the skyline of Ashbury, Virginia, when the crowd began gathering in front of City Hall. News trucks lined the curb, satellite dishes spinning upward like hungry metal flowers. Local reporters jostled for space beside national outlets, their microphones flashing logos in every color. At the center of it all, the makeshift podium stood simple and unadorned. No flags, no banners, just a microphone waiting. Langston Reed stepped through the heavy oak doors precisely at 9:00 a.m., flanked by Savannah on his right and Elijah Boone, his longtime chief of staff, on his left. His face was composed, the bruising at the corner of his mouth still faintly visible. He wore a dark suit today, no tie, his mayoral pin glinting against the lapel. The murmurs died the moment he appeared. He approached the podium without notes, without a teleprompter. The crowd hushed. Langston looked out across the sea of faces, some expectant, some angry, some visibly shaken, and then into the blinking eyes of a dozen cameras. He leaned into the microphone. "I'm not here today because of a misunderstanding," he said, his voice clear, low, and unshakably steady. "I'm here because last night inside a building where I have worked, led, and served for years, my identity wasn't seen for what it was." He paused, letting the weight of that hang in the cold morning air. "This is not about mistaken identity." He continued, his gaze sharp. "This is about what identity people choose to see." The cameras clicked rapidly, the flashes nearly blinding. Langston rested both hands lightly on the podium. When a black man standing in a courthouse is first seen as a threat instead of a leader, we are reminded that titles, elections, and decades of service cannot always shield us from prejudice. Last night I was not recognized, but more importantly, I was not respected. The crowd remained, riveted breaths visible in the chilly air. "I'm not pressing charges today because I want vengeance," Langston said. "I'm taking action because I want accountability. I want answers not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been judged first by the color of their skin before the content of their character." He stepped back from the microphone, giving a small nod to Savannah and Elijah. He had said what needed to be said, no more, no less. But the city was only just beginning to respond. By midday, the leaked footage had exploded across social media. It wasn't polished security cam footage. It was Savannah's phone recording, raw, shaky, painfully real. Langston standing silent but dignified, cuffed with force against a wall while two officers barked questions at him. The hashtags lit up in minutes. Stand with Langston. Ashbury. Justice. Not a suspect. Angry tweets poured in from civil rights leaders. Memes juxtaposing Langston's face next to the words "Mayor, Veteran, Citizen" flooded timelines. And beneath all the noise, something else began to stir, something deeper. Black voters, many of whom had been the backbone of Langston's mayoral election 2 years earlier, voiced their outrage not just online but outside the courthouse steps on talk radio and through the grassroots networks that pulsed beneath the polished surface of the city. veterans groups, longtime allies of Langston from his Army Reserve days, released a joint statement condemning the treatment of one of our own and calling for an independent investigation. The most surprising blow came from an unexpected figure. Retired Judge Marjorie Blake, a towering figure in Ashbury's judicial history, stood at a separate press event that afternoon, her silver hair pulled back, her robes exchanged for a simple navy suit. She didn't mince words. "I've known Langston Reed for over 20 years. She declared, her voice fierce despite her age. "I've seen him stand up for the Constitution when others found it convenient to look away. I've watched him build coalitions across race politics and power. And last night we watched what happens when even the most distinguished among us are reduced to stereotypes by those who wear authority like armor instead of responsibility." The clip aired on every major network within hours. Inside City Hall, Langston sat quietly behind his desk, Savannah and Elijah flanking him again, as the screens filled with talking heads debating the meaning of what had happened. He wasn't celebrating, he wasn't smiling, he was preparing. Because public outrage was powerful, but it was only the beginning of what needed to change. And Langston Reed knew better than anyone the system wouldn't reform itself unless someone forced it into the light. It didn't take long for the backlash to begin. By mid-morning, as Langston Reed sat fielding calls in his City Hall office, the first statement from the Ashbury Police Union dropped like a bombshell. "We stand firmly behind Officer Riker," the union president barked at a hastily called press conference outside the department headquarters. Cameras caught the carefully choreographed display rows of officers standing in solidarity, stone-faced arms folded across broad chests. The words were sharp, rehearsed. This was not about race. This was about procedure. Officers have the right to investigate suspicious activity. Mistakes were made under pressure, but suggesting malicious intent is irresponsible and divisive. Langston watched it play live on the small television mounted in the corner of his office. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. There it was, the familiar pattern. Excuse, first accountability, later, if ever. Minutes after the union's broadcast news came through official channels, Officer Blake Riker was placed on administrative leave, not fired, not even suspended without pay. Paid leave, a reward for failure, Langston thought grimly. Meanwhile, Tom Calder, the younger of the two officers, sensing the tide turning, made a very different decision. Through his attorney, Calder contacted the Internal Affairs Division and agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. If granted, limited immunity for any departmental policy violations. Behind the scenes, City Hall felt like a building under siege. Phones rang off the hook. Angry citizens demanded resignations, while a smaller but vocal group, egged on by online disinformation, accused Langston of waging war on police. Staffers reported seeing unmarked vehicles idling outside the building for hours. An envelope filled with newspaper clippings and the words, "Remember your place," scrawled in marker, arrived anonymously in Langston's office mail. Savannah was the one who opened it. Her hands had trembled slightly, not from fear, but fury. "We need security detail doubled," she said tersely to Elijah after tossing the package onto the desk. But the threats weren't the only thing brewing. Late that evening, after most of City Hall had emptied, Savannah sat alone in her office, combing through files on her laptop. She wasn't just working the current case, she was digging deeper, sensing rot beneath the surface. That's when she found it. Buried deep inside a decades-old personnel archive, half-deleted carelessly, hidden in an outdated digital vault, she uncovered a sealed complaint against Blake Riker. It dated back nearly 8 years long before Langston's mayoral term. A young black teenager had accused Riker of excessive force during a routine sidewalk stop. The complaint had been filed, investigated internally, and then resolved under the tenure of former police chief Harmon Ellis, a man whose career ended not in scandal, but cushioned retirement. Savannah's heart raced as she read the short report summary. Accuser deemed non-credible due to inconsistent testimony. No body cam footage available. Complaint sealed at chief's discretion. Savannah sat back in her chair, fury simmering just beneath her skin. It wasn't just about Langston now. This was a pattern the city had hidden for years. She pulled out her phone and dialed her father. When he answered, his voice was calm but tired. "Daddy, you need to see what I just found." There was a pause. Then quietly he said, "Bring it to me." Outside, the quiet streets of Ashbury glowed under the cold light of street lamps. But inside City Hall, something much hotter was starting to burn. Langston knew the Union would keep trying to spin the story to shield Riker to deny what had unfolded under the courthouse's own roof. But what they hadn't counted on, what they never seemed to count on, was the power of the truth, once it had been dragged out into daylight. And this time Langston Reed wasn't going to let anyone shove it back into the dark. By Monday morning, the battle lines had moved from the courthouse to the heart of Ashbury's government. Langston Reed stood before the full city council, a slim, leather-bound folder tucked neatly under his arm. His bruised jaw had faded to a yellowish hue, but the gravity in his posture remained. He wasn't here to settle scores. He was here to rebuild something better from the wreckage. Around the chamber, council members shifted in their seats, some leaning forward with open expressions, others glancing nervously toward the press gallery where local reporters hovered, pens poised. Langston placed the folder on the central podium, clicked it open, and spoke without notes. "I'm submitting today the Civic Oversight Proposal," he said clearly. "A plan to establish an independent civilian review board with full investigative powers, mandatory reporting on misconduct, and direct authority to recommend disciplinary action. No more internal secrecy, no more self-policing." A low murmur ran through the chamber. Councilwoman Gloria Pettis, a longtime ally, nodded subtly from the second row, but not all faces were welcoming. Councilman Peter Lansing, a sharp-featured man whose district leaned heavily on police union support, raised his hand. "Mayor Reed," Lansing said carefully, "no one doubts what happened to you was regrettable, but rushing into sweeping oversight changes, especially in this political climate, could create unintended consequences." "In other words," Savannah muttered under her breath from the gallery, "they're scared." Langston didn't blink. "What unintended consequence," he asked, his voice steady, "could possibly outweigh what already happened? What's worse than a mayor standing unarmed in a municipal building being tackled, cuffed, and nearly arrested for existing?" Lansing pressed on. "There's concern this will be seen as an attack on law enforcement, alienating good officers and fueling public distrust." Langston leaned slightly forward. "If good officers fear accountability," he said, his voice low but resonant, "then perhaps they were never the officers we needed." The chamber grew tense, brittle. Another council member, Janice Holloway, attempted a softer approach. "Mayor, surely there's a way to phase this in quietly to avoid the optics." Langston's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Optics," he repeated, letting the word hang. "You're worried about how it looks." He took a slow breath, steadying the building anger in his chest. "If a black mayor can't stand safely in his own city hall," he said, his voice rising just enough to fill the room, "then who exactly do you think is safe? The optics you're worried about aren't the problem. The problem is the reality you're asking me to hide." Silence followed, heavy and undeniable. From the back of the chamber, a young journalist, Noah Reyes, a rising reporter for the Ashbury Sentinel, clicked away at his laptop, eyes burning with focus. He wasn't just recording the proposal. He was already drafting the story that would run the next day, one that would peel back layers the council had long pretended weren't there because Noah had uncovered something. 2 more sealed complaints against Officer Riker, one from a Black City employee wrongfully detained after hours, another from a Latino teenager accused without evidence of loitering. Both cases filed quietly, both dismissed after internal review, both buried under confidential settlements and paperwork no one was ever supposed to dig up. Now Noah had them, and soon so would the public. Langston closed the folder softly. "I am not here to make you comfortable," he said finally. "I'm here to make this city honest." Across the room, council members sat frozen, the weight of the moment crackling in the air like a coming storm. They could delay, they could dodge, but Langston Reed had already shifted the ground beneath their feet, and outside these walls, Ashbury was beginning to stir. The tension in Ashbury wasn't simmering anymore, it was boiling. 2 days after Langston's civic oversight proposal shook the council chambers, Savannah Reed found herself face-to-face with an unexpected ally, Officer Tom Calder. He met her after hours just beyond the courthouse steps under the dim glow of a street lamp that barely fought the creeping darkness. His uniform jacket was slung over one shoulder, and his face, once stern with professional detachment, was now tight with something closer to shame. "I shouldn't be here," Calder said in a low voice, glancing around as if the walls themselves might listen. "Then why are you?" Savannah asked sharply, her phone recording in her pocket just in case Calder exhaled, hands jammed into his pockets. "Because what happened that night," he shook his head. "It wasn't just wrong, it was bigger than wrong." He looked Savannah in the eye. "Then, I was scared." "Of what?" Savannah pressed. "Not what, who." He rubbed the back of his neck. Blake Riker. He's had sway in this department for years, unofficial but real. You cross him, your shift schedules change, your evaluations drop, you get reassigned to the worst beats. It's not official retaliation, but everybody knows. And you let that fear put my father in handcuffs. Savannah's voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the fury she'd been swallowing since that night. Calder lowered his head. I did. I won't deny it. He took a slow breath. But I'm ready to fix it. Savannah studied him carefully. I'll testify, Calder said, voice steady now. Internal affairs. The hearing public record, if it comes to that. It wasn't forgiveness he sought. It was absolution through action. And Savannah, though her trust was threadbare these days, knew the value of a witness who had been inside the machine. Across town, Langston was wading through a different kind of storm. National media outlets had descended on Ashbury CNN trucks parked outside City Hall. Civil rights organizations flooded his inbox with offers of support and subtle pressure. Statements needed, interviews requested, marches planned. Everyone wanted the mayor of Ashbury to either be their rallying cry or their symbol of quiet endurance. Langston refused both. He spent long nights drafting careful responses, issuing clear, unapologetic statements. No. He would not let Ashbury's crisis be flattened into a news cycle soundbite. No, he would not allow the focus to shift from systemic change to personal vengeance. But holding that line came at a price. Anonymous death threats slipped into City Hall mail bins. A vandal scrawled, "Traitor," across the steps of his private residence. Still Langston stood tall. Because real change had never come cheap in America. The pressure reached a head at the next emergency council meeting. Word of Calder's pending testimony had leaked. The civic oversight proposal had gained traction, and now Ashbury's soul was quite literally on the docket. The council chamber that night was a powder keg. One side of the gallery was packed with citizens waving signs that read, "Justice for all and oversight." Now, the other half off-duty officers, union members and their supporters held banners claiming, "Protect those who protect us and hands off our cops." The noise started before the meeting was even called to order. Chants from both sides clashed midair, a cacophony of hope and anger. A scuffle broke out near the front doors. Police had to step between protesters to prevent a full brawl. Inside, Langston took his seat calmly, facing a sea of divided faces. He knew that no matter what he said tonight, half the room would hate him. He spoke anyway. "This isn't about sides," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "This is about what side of history we want to be on." The protests continued outside. The council argued inside. And amid it all, Savannah sat in the gallery, phone buzzing in her pocket. Confirmation from Internal Affairs that Calder's statement had been officially filed. The first crack inside the system was no longer hypothetical. It was real. Ashbury wasn't just at a crossroads anymore. It was already stepping into the storm. The courthouse buzzed with a nervous electric energy. Every pew in the public hearing chamber was filled. Reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder with residents. Activists, police union members, city employees, they all came. Some seeking justice, others seeking to defend the status quo. At the front of the room, Langston Reed sat silently, his posture calm but unshakably firm. To his right, Savannah clutched a yellow notepad, every muscle in her body taut with anticipation. Across the aisle, Officer Tom Calder waited, pale, rigid, but determined. And just behind him, Officer Blake Riker sat with arms folded and jaw clenched, his face a portrait of barely concealed disdain. The chairwoman of the Ethics Review Board called the hearing to order. First witness, Officer Tom Calder. Calder rose, adjusted his tie with shaking fingers, and stepped to the stand. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore his oath, and sat down facing the council and the entire city. In a clear but halting voice, Calder described the night at the courthouse. He spoke of how Riker had made a snap judgment about Langston refusing to listen, escalating without cause. He confessed to following Riker's lead out of fear of professional retribution, of becoming a target himself. "I failed to uphold my oath that night," Calder said, his voice trembling. "I knew it was wrong. I knew who Mayor Reed was, and I stayed silent." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Riker sat stone-faced, staring daggers at Calder but saying nothing. Next, it was Langston's turn. The room grew painfully quiet as he rose and approached the podium. He didn't bring notes. He didn't need them. He spoke from a place deeper than memory. He spoke from the wound. "I have stood on this city's sidewalks, in its schools, in its council chambers," he began. voice steady. "I have served it as a public defender, a councilman, and now its mayor. But none of that mattered that night." He paused, letting the silence thicken. "To them, I was not a leader, not a neighbor, not even a man deserving basic dignity. I was a threat, a suspect, a body to be controlled." His voice cracked slightly, only slightly before regaining its strength. "You don't forget what it feels like," Langston said, locking eyes with the council. "You don't forget what it feels like when your humanity is dismissed by the very people sworn to protect it." A few audience members wiped their eyes. Others simply stared, stunned. The chairwoman cleared her throat, visibly shaken. By the end of the hearing, the decision was unanimous. Officer Blake Riker was suspended indefinitely without pay, pending further investigation. And beyond that, the city of Ashbury announced the launch of a full independent audit of the police department, specifically targeting patterns of racially biased policing. For the first time in Ashbury's history, the system was being forced to turn its gaze inward. But Langston and Savannah knew it couldn't end there. In the weeks that followed, Savannah spearheaded a new initiative: free legal workshops across the city, particularly in underrepresented neighborhoods. Flyers went up at laundromats, barbershops, churches, anywhere people gathered. The workshops taught residents their rights during police stops, how to file misconduct reports, how to organize, because real change needed roots. One Saturday afternoon, while setting up folding chairs for a workshop at the Ashbury Community Center, Savannah was approached by an older man distinguished with sharp features and a slow, steady gait. "Langston's girl, right?" he asked. She nodded, smiling politely. The man extended his hand. "Judge Wallace Monroe, your father and I, we go way back." Savannah shook his hand, a question in her eyes. Wallace leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I know what your father's going through. 30 years ago, when I was just a young clerk walking these same halls, I got shoved against a wall by a uniform who thought I didn't belong." Savannah's breath caught. "I filed a complaint," Wallace continued. "Got buried faster than you can say internal review. Learned to stay quiet, learned to work harder, walk straighter, be invisible when it counted." He shook his head slowly. "But Langston..." He smiled, now proud and sorrowful all at once. "Langston didn't learn to disappear. He learned to stand." Savannah blinked back the sudden sting of tears, and in that moment, in that sunlit room filled with folding chairs and paper pamphlets, she understood. This fight wasn't just about her father. It was about every man and woman who had ever been forced to swallow their dignity just to survive another day. And now finally Ashbury was being made to see them. The calls came fast and often. State senators, national civil rights groups, even a few quiet feelers from Washington, all offering Langston Reed the same thing: a bigger stage, a broader reach, a louder microphone. He turned them all down. Ashbury was his home, and the real work, the messy, patient, exhausting work was here. Langston stood outside the courthouse one bright afternoon, watching a group of young artists finish their mural. The paint was still fresh, the colors vivid against the old brick. At the center of the wall, towering 20 feet high, the words curled in bold black letters: "Dignity never needs permission." Below the words, images intertwined, open hands, linked arms, a black man in a simple suit standing tall despite the weight pressing down on him. Langston didn't need a plaque or a portrait. This was enough. Savannah joined him, a clipboard tucked under her arm. "You sure about this?" she asked, a teasing smile on her face. Langston chuckled softly. "You mean letting you run the whole show?" She rolled her eyes. "I mean the advisory board. It's going to be messy, political, exhausting." "Good," Langston said. "Then it's worth doing." Earlier that week, the Ashbury City Council had voted unanimously to establish the Civil Rights Advisory Board, an independent body to monitor law enforcement practices, advocate for policy reforms, and serve as a bridge between citizens and city officials. They didn't just want oversight, they wanted change embedded into the foundation of the city. Savannah had been their first choice to lead it, not because of her last name, but because of what she had proven: strength without arrogance, compassion without compromise. Across Ashbury, ripples spread. Inspired by Langston's story, two neighboring cities, Fairmont and Cedar Hollow, opened investigations into their own police departments. Old complaints were pulled from dusty archives. Citizens demanded public hearings. New faces ran for city council seats, once seen as untouchable. The quiet had been broken. Langston watched a group of schoolchildren walking past the mural, some pointing up wide-eyed. Maybe he thought they wouldn't have to learn dignity through pain. Maybe they'd learn it from what their city chose to honor. Savannah elbowed him lightly. "You know," she said, "they're going to name a park after you someday." Langston laughed a real laugh from somewhere deep. "Let them name it after the people," he said. "The ones who showed up, the ones who stood when it was easier to sit." Savannah looked at him for a long moment. "You changed things," she said softly. Langston shook his head. "No." He corrected his eyes, never leaving the mural. "We just finally made them see what had been there all along." The sun dipped lower, casting a golden light across the square. Langston felt the weight of the past, but also the strange, beautiful lightness of a future not yet written. It wouldn't be perfect. Change never was, but it would be real, and that was enough. As the courthouse doors closed behind them and the streets of Ashbury hummed with life, a simple truth settled over the city. This story began in silence. It ended in action. And somewhere, somehow, another story was just beginning. The walls of Ashbury's courthouse still stand, but after that night they no longer echo. They carry the footsteps of a man who refused to disappear, the voices of a city that chose to see, and the truth that dignity was never something to be granted. It was ours all along. If this story moved you, if it made you think, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to join us for more stories where courage confronts injustice and